All right, folks. Mr. Hansen here. I want to go through with you guys if you need a little more help working on this first exercise. It's exercise sketch creation in the introduction to CAD learning pathway. So if you're having trouble kind of getting your very first sketch to work, I'm going to go through some of the details and explain what's going on here with creating a sketch in Onshape. So if you log into Onshape, your screen should look something like this. This is the documents window. Got all the things that you'll create or have created, details about that. To create a document in Onshape, obviously go up to the Create button, and if you go down, we're going to create a document. This is where our design is going to be stored. Go ahead and name this something meaningful. For example, this is exercise sketch creation. And if you name stuff, it'll be really easy to use the search features to search for your designs. Once you have like a bazillion things you've made over the course of this year, next year, 3 years if you complete this pathway, you'll have a bunch of designs you want to be able to search through those. So I'm going to create a document there. And when you create your document in Onshape, it's going to start with kind of a blank slate from which you can work. You got your features menu here at the top. You got the list of features that you'll create. There's some default things that it starts with. It's a point, that's the origin, and our 3 default sketching planes. And of course, down in the bottom, you got all the parts, studios, and assemblies and drawings that you create over the course of building a design. So hopefully you've got a chance to go through that first little learning pathway that went through sort of the interface. So hopefully it's a little bit familiar with it. I would advise, if you're going through these exercises, to have the exercise open on one side of your screen, have Onshape open on the other side. Makes it really easy to go through these exercises. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. First things first, we got our document open. We're going to create a sketch. Pretty much every design in computer-aided design starts with some kind of 2D sketch. And we've got these 3 two-dimensional planes to work from. So if you've taken geometry, you've talked about planes. All I mean is by a plane is like a flat surface that's like 2-dimensional. So if you were to start sketching something on a piece of paper, that's a flat drawing that you're making. We're going to start with a flat sketch to start making our parts. And so there's a button up at the top feature menu to create a sketch. You'll see in parentheses it's got the keyboard shortcut for creating that sketch, which in this case is Shift S. So I'm going to hit Shift S. And I'm going to try and use a lot of keyboard shortcuts here. It really does make things a lot faster to work through if you get familiar with those shortcuts. Now you'll see the sketch 1 is red. We need to select that flat sketching plane to sketch on before we can actually do anything. And so the directions say to select that front default plane. The plane that you sketch on is going to kind of depend on what you're designing, and you'll get used to selecting the right plane as we continue to create things. But I'm going to highlight this front plane, click that. Now I'm ready to sketch. So you'll see that my view is kind of obstructed a little bit. Here's some real quick tips for being able to view your designs a little more efficiently. If you scroll in and out, slide with 2 fingers if you're using a Chromebook on a touchpad, that'll zoom in and out. If you right click, so click with 2 fingers on a Chromebook, that'll pan around so you can view your designs from different angles. If you hit Control and right click, that'll slide your screen around so you can view different parts of the screen. And if you go crazy and suddenly your view's all messed up and you can't make heads or tails of things, there's this magic little view cube up here in the top right corner. If you click on it, it'll automatically reorient to a specific view. So for example, we're sketching on the front plane. I'm going to rotate this around until I see the front plane. Click on that, maybe zoom out a little bit. And now I got a nice clean view of that front plane. I'm ready to start sketching. So let me zoom into the next slide. For this first slide, we're going to get started with geometry. Sketches use a lot of geometry. If you haven't taken geometry yet, then some of this stuff might be kind of new. But I'm assuming most of y'all know what a line is, a rectangle, circle. Those are all familiar things. I'm assuming most of you guys know what perpendicular or parallel means. Equals. You guys probably know what equals means. These are terms that are hopefully familiar to you, and as we go through and apply these to geometry, hopefully it makes sense what they mean as we go along. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we're going to create for this particular design is a rectangle. And so the rectangle tool is, get this, the tool at the top menu that looks like a rectangle. And actually, if you hit the drop-down box, there are two different ways of making a rectangle. We're going to use this corner rectangle, and you'll see right next to it that keyboard shortcut is G. So I'm going to hit G, and I'm going to make my rectangle. Now, before you actually click to make your rectangle, we need to think about a few things. You see in our drawing how this bottom edge of the rectangle, it's on this origin point. So I want to click over to the side of this origin point so that when I make my rectangle going through this origin point, no matter how I move things, that rectangle is always going to be attached to the origin. So it's a good idea when you start a sketch to have something in your geometry that's connected to the origin. And so in this case, that's going to be this bottom line. Now, if you make your rectangle, like it'll let me keep clicking and making a bazillion rectangles. That's not what I want, so hit escape and you'll get out of that rectangle tool. Now I just made a bunch of garbage, so I'm going to hit Control-Z to undo and get rid of the stuff that I don't want. Control-Z is your friend. That's the undo, and the button up is up here. All right, so this is my rectangle. And I'm actually going to go up here where it says Show Constraints in my Sketch tool, and that's going to show me all the geometry that this rectangle has. So you can mouse over and look at this geometry. For example, this symbol right here, if you're familiar with it, it means perpendicular. So perpendicular means two lines intersect at a right angle, and look at the lines that are highlighted. They obviously intersect at a right angle. That's a perpendicular constraint. No matter how I move this object around, these two lines are always going to be perpendicular. The two dashed lines, that means parallel. So these two lines that are highlighted, they're always going to be parallel. No matter how I move things around, they're always constrained to be parallel. And so each of these constraints forces something with our geometry to be true. And that'll help us create rigorous designs that are easy to update and change and are accurately represent what we want to build in real life. So for example, this origin point, it needs to be in the midpoint of this line. We want to have some symmetry. We want this thing to be centered around this middle axis. And so there's a constraint up here that'll let you do that. This constraint menu is all the way over on the right. Depending on how big your screen is in Onshape, you might see all the constraint tools, or it might be in a drop-down menu like this. I'm going to select midpoint, and a midpoint is a point in the middle. So if I click that midpoint constraint, click a point, there we go, click a line, click that origin, it's going to move things so that that origin point is centered in the middle of the line. And so again, no matter how I move things around, that point's always going to be centered in that line. So I've added that constraint here, and you can see the symbol for midpoint right here. The next thing we want to add is this line going through the middle of our rectangle. So I'm going to go up here and select the line tool. The keyboard shortcut's L on your laptop. So I'm going to click one point to the line, click another point to the line. Now, if you can keep clicking again and make like a bazillion lines. Hit escape to get out of that. You can always Control-Z if you make some extra lines. Now, one thing you should notice is that this line going through the middle of this drawing is dashed, whereas the line you just made was solid. So the tool to change that is this construction tool. Keyboard shortcut is Q, so I'm going to hit Q. Well, I'm going to select my line, then hit Q. That's going to make that a dashed line. So construction lines are lines that I'm going to use to build my object, but they aren't actually part of the object itself. So they're kind of like reference lines that help me build this thing. So you'll notice now that you can select this whole rectangle instead of selecting either half of this rectangle, because as far as the software is concerned, this line isn't really part of our object. So that's everything with step 2. Let's go on to the next step. Here we're going to add some more lines and arcs. Let's start with this arc along the bottom. So an arc is just a portion of a circle. There's a tool for drawing full circles here. Next to that is the arc tool. And so I'm going to hit A for what's called a 3-point arc. I'm going to click one endpoint. I'm going to click another endpoint. and I missed, so I'm going to try again. There we go. And then I can kind of drag this and click to set how big that circle is. So you notice it's a dashed line. It's because I had my construction line tool turned on. So I'm actually going to hit escape, click this, hit Q, and that'll make that not a construction line. Now, obviously, the circle I've got here is too big in proportion to what it should be. And there's a couple ways we can fix this. But if you read the direction, it asks you to add what's called a tangent constraint to the vertical sides of the rectangle. Again, if you've taken geometry, you know what tangent means. And if I hit this little drop-down box, there's a tangent constraint. It's just what the picture looks like. A tangent constraint takes a line in a circle and makes them just touch once. So like, for example, if you visualized this line continuing on forever, and it's going to hit the circle twice. Tangent, so I'm going to hit T for my tangent tool, click the line, click the circle. We'll see now that if this line was to continue forever, it would just hit the circular arc once. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side just to make this symmetric. So now I've got the arc on the bottom. Let me go ahead and add these lines at the top. It's kind of like looks kind of like a trapezoid on the top. I'm going to hit L for the line tool. And I'm going to click and make this shape. Now, if I were to click and drag these points, it's definitely not symmetric, and it definitely doesn't look close to the proportions. So I do want to go through and make sure I've got some consistent geometry constraints here. This top line is vertical. I can see that little vertical line telling me, horizontal. But you'll see that this line here is not attached to the endpoint of my vertical line. And so, I can try to click, move, and drag it over that line. I could, try undoing and drawing this line again so it goes through that point. So that point's highlighted. There's a constraint that'll help with this. It's called the coincident constraint. The shortcut is I. And what coincident means when I'm talking about the geometry in computer-aided design is that two objects are on top of each other. They're lined up. So for example, if I've got a point and a line that are coincident, that means the point is on that line somewhere. Now again, this thing is supposed to be symmetric, so I want to also make sure that the sides of this little trapezoid are the same. And you can see I can move these lines around still so that they're not the same. That's a slight problem. So I'm going to go down here to equals. I'm going to click one line, click the other line. And of course, what it means for two lines to be equal, it means that those two lines are the same length. So now, no matter how I move this thing around, those lines are going to stay the same length, which is good for what I'm designing. So you may notice that the proportions, like the general size of what you've created, isn't exactly like it is in the picture in the exercise. And that's okay. We haven't added dimensions to this. We're going through and establishing the fundamental geometric relationships that are going to make this work. We will go in and add sizes here in a little bit. But if the size is off just a little bit, as long as you got the general shape, you should be good to go to the next step. All right, this one's pretty easy. Add a circle. Bam, there's a circle tool. Shortcut is C on your keyboard. So I'm going to hit C. I want to make sure that origin point is highlighted because I want this circle to be stuck to the center of that origin. I'm going to make my circle there. The other step here asks you to make some lines, construction lines. So these two horizontal lines should be construction lines. So I'm going to click one line, hit Q on my keyboard, click the other line, do the same thing, and now those will be construction lines. And you can notice that I can select everything inside this now all at once. Going on to the next slide, we got to add this little top rectangle thing to our circle. And I'm actually going to go ahead and turn off my constraints just so it's a little less busy here. Easiest way to do this is to add some lines. So I'm going to add some lines. And if you look at the constraints, like the constraints say the lines on the side of this little keyhole thing should be vertical. The line on the top should be horizontal. So while I'm making this, I'm just going to make sure that my lines are snapped to the vertical and that my lines are snapped to the horizontal. And that'll make sure I already have those constraints. That means I don't have to go in and add those constraints later. And if you need to go in and add them, that's fine. Like this line here, I didn't get it quite vertical, so I'm going to hit vertical, V on your keyboard, click this line. That's going to move it so it's vertical. Now you notice that this little rectangle thing on the top is supposed to be centered, keeping with our symmetry around this center vertical line. The constraint I'm missing here is an equals constraint. So I'm going to hit E for equals, hit this line, and that's going to resize those so that those two lines are equal. And because of the way that we've built this, that little keyhole thing is going to be centered. Alrighty. Next slide. Now things are going to start getting fun. We can add dimensions to this sketch that we're making. So a dimension in computer-aided design refers to the size of something. So for example, if I'm talking about the dimension of a line, I'm talking about the length of the line. If I'm talking about the dimension of a circle, there I could be talking about a lot of different things. The radius or diameter or arc length are all different ways about talking about how big a circle is. So the dimension tool in Onshape is actually pretty smart. It'll figure out what it needs to refer to based on what you click. So the dimension tool is this double arrow symbol on the top features menu. This keyboard shortcut is D, so I'm going to hit D. And I'm going to start kind of working my way outside in. So I've got this outside measurement that's 3.5. That's going from this top line to this construction line on the bottom. And so I click those two lines. I'm going to go off to the side and click again and type in 3.5. And that'll resize those two things so that they're 3.5. Now that may kind of mess up your sketch a little bit, and that's okay. As we go in and add these dimensions, things should get back to how we expect them. If it helps, you're welcome to kind of click and drag things so that they're more proportional to what you're expecting in the picture. For example, the dimension between the center construction line and this bottom construction line looks like that's 2.5. And then I've got the distance between the top of this keyhole and the bottom construction line. Looks like that's 1.25. And I've got the width of this thing on top, which is 0.75. And so I'm getting closer to the correct size. Let me go on to the next slide and get the rest of these dimensions. Here we're dimensioning the circular parts of this. So I'm going to, I unselected my dimension tool, so I'm going to hit D to select that. So if I select this circle here in the middle and click that, Onshape knows I'm clicked on a circle. So it's going to default in this case to the diameter of the circle, which is 2. Same thing for this arc. If I click on this arc, the important way of sizing an arc is going to be the radius of the arc. So if I click on that, you'll see a little R next to the dimension. That means radius. So the radius is 2 or the diameter is 4. That's going to resize things. So this looks a little bit weird, so I'm actually going to click and drag that in here. All right, next slide. Here we're going to add an angle dimension. And so again, have your dimension tool selected. Click one line, click the other line, and that'll let you type in an angle measurement. So if you click 2 lines, it's automatically going to know you need to size an angle. And so there is my sketch. One more thing, please don't close out your design yet. In order to save this sketch, you got to hit this green check mark at the top. If you hit escape, if you hit the red X, that'll actually delete all changes. And you can't undo that, but make sure you hit that green check mark to save your sketch. Another thing you'll notice, let me open my sketch up again. All the lines that were blue are now black. That is fantastic. That means everything in my sketch, all the lines and angles and circles and whatever, there's no more information I can add to this. I can't add any more constraints. I can't add any more dimensions. Everything is perfectly defined. And that's what we're going for in most of your designs. So it's something you want to be aware of. There's no more freedom to move anything around. So One more thing before I let you go. Next slide. There's some tools here that'll help you get some information about this sketch. And this is part of the reason we want to use construction lines. If I click inside my sketch, it'll highlight the interior part of the sketch. Down in the bottom right-hand corner, there's what's called measurement information and materials information. Here I can figure out like the lengths of things, area, volume once we start working in 3 dimensions. We can set materials, so we can make this metal or plastic or whatever. So if you click a line, it'll tell you how long that line is. If you click an area, it'll tell you what the area is. If you click between a point and a line, it's going to give you the minimum distance between the point and the line. So it'll give you some information about the geometry of your object. And so most of these exercises will have a kind of like a self-check where you can see if you created it correctly by verifying a measurement of your sketch. So see if you can select inside this and figure out what the correct area is. And that'll tell you right off the bat whether or not you did this correctly. Because chances are if you created your sketch correctly, your area measurement should be pretty much spot on. So give that a shot. If you need some more help, feel free to let me know.